Welcome to Land of Horror, where horror stories come to life like never before. In today's video, we will explore chilling true events, unsolved mysteries, and the fears lurking in the shadows. From bone-chilling murder cases to supernatural phenomena that defy all explanation, each story will take you on a journey filled with tension and suspense. You will hear about real individuals who have faced terrifying moments, life and death situations, and discoveries that send chills down anyone's spine. Prepare yourself for moments of anxiety and thrills, because these stories aren't just fiction, but the dark truths of life. Don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications to join us in uncovering even more horrifying mysteries. The small South Carolina town of Prospect had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew their neighbors, and the only commotion was a local baseball game or a town hall meeting. It was the summer of 1969 when that began to change. Subtle at first, nothing too alarming, but enough to send ripples of unease through the community. It started with the disappearance of Abigail Pearson, a bright-eyed 17-year-old who had been walking home from her shift at the local diner one evening. Her parents, worried sick, had contacted the sheriff, but after a day or two of searching, they were met with the tired old excuse, teenagers these days probably just ran off with a boy. The official response did little to calm the nerves of the residents, and soon whispers began to circulate in hushed tones. Have you heard? Another one's gone. The second disappearance hit Prospect only a week later. Daniel Shaw, just 20, was last seen walking through the woods on the outskirts of town, on his way to visit his girlfriend. Like Abigail, Daniel vanished without a trace, and the sense of unease that had simmered beneath the surface now began to boil. People started locking their doors earlier, keeping their kids indoors as the sun dipped below the horizon. Some even packed up and left town altogether. But not Ethan Moore. A detective for the Prospect Police Department, Ethan had been raised in this town and knew it like the back of his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. This wasn't a case of kids running away. The silence that followed each disappearance felt too intentional, too eerie. Ethan began his investigation the day after Daniel Shaw went missing. He combed through Daniel's life, talking to friends and family, retracing his steps, but no clues emerged. And yet, that nagging feeling stayed with him. Ethan had seen his fair share of tragedies in his career, but something about this case unsettled him in a way he hadn't experienced before. He sensed a predator lurking beneath the surface, unseen but ever-present. It wasn't until a month later that the first real clue emerged. A group of teenagers, hanging out by the old abandoned mill, stumbled upon something none of them would forget, a small patch of earth where the soil looked freshly turned, unusual for that area. Curiosity, and perhaps a bit of morbid excitement, led one of the boys to start digging. What he unearthed was nothing short of terrifying, fragments of torn clothing and a shoe, small enough to belong to a teenager. Ethan was called to the scene immediately, and as soon as he saw the remnants, he felt a chill run down his spine. It matched the description of what Abigail had been wearing the night she disappeared. The discovery turned the quiet unease in the town into full-blown fear. Parents pulled their children from school, businesses closed early, and town meetings were filled with heated debates about safety and how to handle the growing crisis. But amidst the panic, one name kept surfacing in conversations behind closed doors: Donald Henry Gaskins, or as everyone called him, Pee-wee. Gaskins had always been an odd figure in the town, a small man, standing at just 5 feet 2 inches and weighing under 130 pounds. He had a criminal record, sure, but nothing that had ever pointed to the kind of evil Ethan suspected. Still, Gaskins' name was whispered in connection to the disappearances. His presence at the fringes of town life, his unsettling demeanor, and the way he seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, it all raised questions Ethan couldn't ignore. Ethan remembered Gaskins from his younger days, a man whose small frame hid a fiery temper. He had been involved in various petty crimes over the years, but nothing substantial. Yet, there was something about him that made people uncomfortable. He had a way of making you feel like you were always being watched, like a predator biding his time. The rumors of his violent tendencies were known to many in town, but there had never been enough evidence to pin anything serious on him. Ethan decided it was time to pay Gaskins a visit. The men lived in a rundown shack on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown trees and tall, unkempt grass. It was the kind of place you didn't just stumble upon, it was deliberately isolated, a perfect hideaway. The drive out there felt longer than usual, the humid South Carolina air clinging to Ethan as he rolled down the dusty road. When he arrived, Gaskins was sitting on his porch, carving something out of a block of wood. He didn't look surprised to see Ethan, and that unnerved him even more. "Detective Moore," Gaskins said, his voice light but with an edge. "What brings you out here?" "I wanted to ask you a few questions, Donald," Ethan said, stepping out of his car, hand resting lightly on his belt. "Oh, questions now, is it?" Gaskins chuckled, setting the carving down. "Well, come on inside then, no sense in standing out here in the heat." Ethan hesitated for just a second, something about Gaskins' hospitality feeling rehearsed, but he followed him inside. The shack was dark, and the air was thick with a smell Ethan couldn't quite place, a mix of damp wood and something far more unpleasant, like rotting meat. The two men sat down at a small, scratched-up table. Gaskins leaned back in his chair, a slight smile on his face, as if he knew exactly why Ethan was there but found it all amusing. "Now, what can I help you with?" Gaskins asked. "There've been some disappearances in town. Kids mostly, some adults too." "I'm sure you've heard the rumors," Ethan started, watching Gaskins' reaction closely. "Oh, I've heard," Gaskins said, nodding. "Tragic, ain't it? You think I've got something to do with it, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer immediately, but the silence said enough. Gaskins' smile widened, his eyes narrowing. "See, people have been saying things about me for years. They don't like what they don't understand," Gaskins said, his voice dropping a bit. "But I ain't no monster, detective. Just a man trying to live his life." "I've been hearing a lot of things, Donald," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. "And I want to make sure we're not missing anything." Gaskins leaned forward, his expression darkening. "You're wasting your time, detective. You want monsters? Look somewhere else." There was something in Gaskins' eyes then, a flicker of something darker, and Ethan knew he was staring at a man capable of far worse than anyone in Prospect had ever imagined. After the conversation, Ethan left feeling more unsettled than ever. Gaskins hadn't admitted to anything, but the cold way he dismissed the disappearances, combined with the strange atmosphere of his home, left Ethan with a growing certainty that he was looking at the men responsible. Yet, there was no hard evidence, nothing to justify an arrest, nothing to tie him to the missing kids. And that made Ethan feel helpless. But then, another break in the case emerged. It had been days since Ethan Moore's unsettling encounter with Donald Gaskins, but the tension that sat in his gut refused to leave him. Something about the men was wrong, far more than Ethan could express. The way Gaskins had spoken about the disappearances with such detached calm, as if the lives lost meant nothing to him, left a lingering sense of dread. Every day after that conversation, Ethan's mind spiraled further into the belief that Gaskins was the key to solving the mystery. But there was no evidence, nothing tangible that could link the men to the crimes. And with the town spiraling into fear, pressure mounted on Ethan to act. He spent hours at the police station, poring over missing persons reports, digging into Gaskins' past, looking for patterns. The more he searched, the more obsessed he became. His wife, Caroline, noticed his growing distance. "You're barely home anymore, Ethan," she said one night as he sat at the kitchen table, going through stacks of old files. "This case is consuming you." "I know," Ethan replied, running a hand through his graying hair. "But I'm close, Caroline. I can feel it. Gaskins, he's involved in this, I'm sure of it. I just need to find the proof." Caroline sighed, leaning against the counter, her face etched with concern. "Just don't let it take everything from you, okay? We still need you here." Ethan nodded but said nothing. His thoughts were already back on the case. The next morning, Ethan returned to the area near the old mill where Abigail's clothes had been found. Something told him he'd missed something there. He brought along his partner, Detective Tom Briggs, a seasoned cop with a no-nonsense attitude. Tom had been skeptical of Ethan's suspicions about Gaskins but agreed to help anyway. They arrived at the overgrown lot just after dawn, the sun barely breaking through the thick canopy of trees. The place felt wrong, like the air itself was heavier here. As they walked through the tall grass, Tom grumbled under his breath. "I still don't see what you think we're gonna find out here, Ethan. We already combed this place twice." "There's something here," Ethan muttered, scanning the area with his flashlight. "I don't know what, but I feel it." Tom shook his head but followed along, his boots crunching over the dead leaves that littered the ground. They moved deeper into the wooded area, beyond where the initial discovery of Abigail's clothes had been made. Ethan's instincts told him that this place was a graveyard of secrets, and he was determined to uncover them. After nearly 2 hours of searching, Tom was about to suggest they call it a day when Ethan's flashlight flickered across something unusual, a slight depression in the ground near the base of a large oak tree. The soil looked disturbed, though it had been packed down as if someone had tried to cover it up. Ethan knelt down, running his hand over the dirt. "What do you think?" Tom asked, crouching beside him. "I think we need to dig." Without waiting for a response, Ethan grabbed a nearby stick and began scraping away the loose earth. Tom reluctantly followed suit, helping clear the area. After several minutes, they uncovered something that made Ethan's blood run cold, a scrap of fabric, torn and weathered, buried just below the surface. Ethan recognized it immediately. It was from Daniel Shaw's jacket, the one his girlfriend had described to him in painstaking detail. Ethan sat back on his heels, staring at the fabric. "We found something, Tom." Tom's expression hardened. "It's not enough, though. We can't build a case on a piece of fabric." "I know," Ethan said, standing up. "But this confirms what I've been thinking. Gaskins is involved. I just need to find out how deep it goes." Back at the station, Ethan was restless. He knew Gaskins was watching him, waiting. The man had a way of making it feel like he was always one step ahead, like he knew exactly what Ethan was planning. That night, Ethan received a letter, hand-delivered to his home. There was no return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was Gaskins. "Detective Moore. You're not as smart as you think you are. The answers you're looking for, they've been right in front of you the whole time. Maybe you should look closer. Maybe you should look inside. Pee-wee." The letter sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. The cryptic message was vague, but the threat was clear. Gaskins was toying with him, baiting him to continue the chase. Ethan's mind raced, trying to decipher the meaning behind Gaskins' words. Look inside. Inside where? Was it another body? Another clue hidden somewhere nearby? Ethan spent the next several days investigating every possible lead, but each one seemed to lead to another dead end. He grew increasingly frustrated, his lack of progress eating away at him. And yet, Gaskins' taunts continued. Another letter arrived a week later, this time with a photograph, an old, grainy picture of the woods near Gaskins' shack. The caption on the back read, "Keep digging." By now, Ethan was certain that Gaskins was leading him towards something much larger than a few missing persons cases. He believed Gaskins had buried his victims all around the town, creating a body farm of sorts, a place where he could return to his crimes and relive them. The thought sickened Ethan, but it also fueled his determination. He spent nights driving the roads around Gaskins' property, looking for anything out of the ordinary, any small sign that could point to where the bodies might be hidden. His sleep was becoming more sporadic, his temper shorter. The case had consumed him entirely. One evening, after another fruitless search, Ethan returned home to find Caroline waiting for him in the living room, her arms crossed. "Ethan, this has to stop," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "You're not the same anymore. This case, it's taking everything from you. I hardly see you, and when I do, you're somewhere else. I need my husband back." Ethan looked at her, guilt washing over him. He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice soft. "But I can't let it go. If I don't stop him, no one will." Caroline's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I just don't want to lose you, Ethan." "You won't," he promised, though even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Ethan was reviewing aerial photographs of the land surrounding Gaskins' shack when he noticed something odd. There was a section of forest near the edge of town that had been cleared, though it wasn't marked on any map. It was a remote area, far enough away from any homes or businesses that no one would have noticed if someone had been digging there. Ethan and Tom headed out to the site the next morning, armed with shovels and a sense of grim determination. The air was thick with humidity as they reached the clearing. It was eerily quiet, the only sound being the distant chirping of birds. They started digging in the center of the clearing, and within minutes, they hit something hard. Ethan's heart raced as they unearthed what appeared to be an old wooden box. It was crude, hastily built, and large enough to hold. Tom pried the lid open, and the stench that hit them was overpowering. Inside the box were the skeletal remains of at least 2 bodies, their bones tangled together in a grotesque display. Ethan felt bile rise in his throat, but he forced himself to remain focused. This was the proof he needed. They called in the forensic team, who quickly confirmed that the remains matched the profiles of 2 missing teenagers, Jessica Harris and Matt Carter, both of whom had disappeared over a year ago. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at the box as the team worked to excavate the rest of the area. He had found what he was looking for, but it didn't bring the sense of relief he had hoped for. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something far darker. Gaskins had left this here for him to find. He had planned every step, knowing exactly how Ethan would react. And now, Ethan realized, the real game was about to begin. Ethan stood at the edge of the grave, watching as the forensic team bagged the remains of the victims. The air was thick with the scent of death and decay, and yet, Ethan's mind was elsewhere. He had found the bodies, yes, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like Gaskins had orchestrated every move, had led him here deliberately. The media descended on the town within hours. Headlines screamed about the serial killer's latest victims, reigniting the panic that had once gripped the town. Reporters hounded Ethan for statements, but he remained silent. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were only scratching the surface of something much darker. Back home, Caroline watched the news with a worried expression. "You need to stop, Ethan," she said as he walked through the door late that night. "This case is destroying you." Ethan shook his head. "I'm close. I can feel it. Gaskins is taunting me, but I'm going to stop him." "But at what cost?" Caroline's voice cracked, tears welling in her eyes. "You're barely sleeping. You're not eating. I hardly know you anymore." Ethan turned away, staring out the window into the darkness. He knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he was so close. The next morning, Ethan found another letter waiting for him on the porch. The handwriting was the same, sloppy, jagged. He tore it open, already dreading what he might find. "Detective Moore. You're a step behind. You've always been a step behind. It's not about the bodies, Ethan. It's about the game. And I'm winning. Pee-wee." Ethan crumpled the letter in his hand, anger surging through him. Gaskins was playing with him, toying with his mind. But this time, it felt more personal. The taunt wasn't just about the investigation, it was about him. Over the next few days, more letters arrived. Each one was more disturbing than the last, filled with cryptic messages that seemed to suggest Gaskins knew intimate details about Ethan's life. The letters spoke of his home, his wife, even his childhood. Gaskins had clearly been watching him, studying him, learning everything about him. Ethan's mind raced as he tried to decipher the meaning behind the letters. He spent hours at the station, poring over case files, trying to find some connection he had missed. He barely slept, and when he did, his dreams were haunted by Gaskins' face, laughing at him from the shadows. Determined to get inside Gaskins' head, Ethan began interviewing people from the killer's past, former neighbors, family members, even inmates who had served time with him. The stories they told painted a chilling picture of a man who had always been a master manipulator. "He was small, sure, but don't let that fool you," one former cellmate had said, his voice low and cautious. "He knew how to get inside your head, make you do things you never thought you'd do." Another inmate described how Gaskins had once convinced a fellow prisoner to take the blame for a crime he hadn't committed, just by playing on the man's insecurities. "He knew how to find your weakness, and once he had it, he owned you." Ethan listened to each account, piecing together the puzzle of Gaskins' mind. The man wasn't just a killer, he was a puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, making others dance to his tune. Just when it seemed like the investigation was hitting another dead end, a new lead emerged. A young woman named Lucy Hartman came forward, claiming she had once been held captive by Gaskins but had managed to escape. Her story was horrifying. She had been lured into his trap by a false promise of work, then drugged and taken to a remote cabin in the woods. She had been kept there for days, bound and gagged, as Gaskins toyed with her mind, telling her she would never escape. But one night, when Gaskins had left her alone, she had managed to free herself and run. Ethan was skeptical at first. Lucy's story sounded too good to be true. But as she described the cabin in detail, Ethan's pulse quickened. The location matched an area near the mill, not far from where Abigail's clothes had been found. "We need to go there," Ethan said, turning to Tom, his partner. Now. The two detectives, along with a small team, headed out to the cabin that afternoon. It was a dilapidated structure, hidden deep in the woods, far from any roads or trails. The place reeked of neglect and decay, the windows boarded up, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as they approached the building. He knew this was it. This was where Gaskins had held his victims. But something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet. They entered the cabin cautiously, weapons drawn. The inside was just as decrepit as the outside, dusty, empty, devoid of life. But as they moved deeper into the house, they found a trapdoor leading to a basement. Ethan's gut twisted with unease as they descended into the darkness. The basement was damp and cold, the smell of mold thick in the air. And there, in the corner, they found what they had been looking for, a hidden room, its walls lined with photos of the missing. Abigail, Daniel, Jessica, all of them. But there was something else, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. Among the photos was a picture of Caroline, his wife. It had been taken recently, in their own backyard. Gaskins had been there. He had been watching. The discovery shook Ethan to his core. He had been so focused on the investigation that he hadn't realized how close Gaskins had come to his own home. Caroline was in danger, and it was all because of him. He rushed home that night, heart pounding in his chest, but Caroline was nowhere to be found. Panic set in as he called her phone, but there was no answer. Hours passed, and still, nothing. When she finally returned, safe and unharmed, Ethan was a wreck. He held her tight, refusing to let go. But the damage had been done. His obsession with the case had put her in harm's way, and he couldn't forgive himself for it. From that moment on, Ethan's grip on reality began to slip. He became paranoid, convinced that Gaskins was watching him at every turn. He started seeing shadows where there were none, hearing whispers in the dead of night. His dreams were plagued by visions of Caroline being taken, tortured, killed. At work, his colleagues noticed the change in him. He was jumpy, irritable, snapping at people for no reason. Tom tried to talk to him, but Ethan pushed him away. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. As the days passed, Ethan's mind became a prison. He was trapped in a never-ending nightmare, haunted by the knowledge that Gaskins was always one step ahead. And no matter what he did, he couldn't escape. The final straw came when Gaskins struck again, this time, closer to home than ever. Ethan received a call late one night, the voice on the other end calm and chilling. "You've lost, Detective Moore. You'll never catch me. And now, someone else has to pay the price." The line went dead, and Ethan's heart stopped. He knew what was coming. Racing to Caroline's side, he found her alive, but barely. Gaskins had left his mark, both physically and mentally. She was broken, a shell of the woman she had once been. Ethan's quest for justice had cost him everything. And now, it wasn't about stopping Gaskins anymore. It was about revenge. Ethan watched as Caroline sat by the window, her eyes vacant and distant. She had been back from the hospital for days, but she wasn't the same. Her body had healed, the bruises fading into pale scars, but her mind remained fractured, haunted by the trauma Gaskins had inflicted. Every night, she woke up screaming, and every day, she drifted further away from him. He blamed himself. It was his fault. His obsession with Gaskins had brought this horror into their lives. He couldn't protect her, just like he couldn't protect any of the victims. Ethan clenched his fists, the weight of his failure crushing him. He had to stop Gaskins, not for justice anymore, but for revenge. Returning to work was a battle in itself. His colleagues avoided him, whispering behind his back, worried about the erratic behavior that had begun to define him. Even Tom, his longtime partner, seemed distant. Ethan knew they didn't trust him anymore, not after what happened with Caroline. But he didn't care. His mind was singularly focused on one thing: finding Gaskins and ending this nightmare once and for all. Ethan wasn't ready for the call that came in the middle of the night. The crime scene was eerily similar to Gaskins' previous killings: a young woman, her body mutilated beyond recognition, left in a remote area outside town. It was as if Gaskins was daring Ethan to come after him. And that's exactly what Ethan intended to do. The crime scene told a familiar story. Gaskins had left clues behind, breadcrumbs leading Ethan to his next move. But this time, it felt more deliberate, more calculated. The killer was playing with him, testing his limits, pushing him closer to the edge. When Ethan returned home that night, he found a small package waiting on the porch. His heart sank as he recognized the handwriting: Gaskins. He opened it with trembling hands, revealing a small cassette tape. The sound of the woman's voice, pleading for her life, sent chills down his spine. Gaskins had recorded her final moments, taunting him, knowing that there was nothing Ethan could do to stop it. The tape was more than a taunt, it was a message. Gaskins was planning something bigger, something that would make everything before seem trivial. And now, Ethan was in a race against time to stop him. As Ethan's obsession grew, his relationship with Caroline continued to deteriorate. She barely spoke to him, withdrawing into herself more each day. Ethan tried to reach out, but every attempt was met with silence or anger. She blamed him, and he knew she was right. He had brought Gaskins into their lives, and now she was paying the price. Work offered no escape. His colleagues grew more distant, their concern for him overshadowed by their growing distrust. Ethan became reckless, pushing the investigation forward with little regard for procedure or safety. His mind was consumed by Gaskins, leaving little room for anything else. Night after night, Ethan was plagued by visions of the victims: Abigail, Jessica, Daniel, and now the nameless woman on the tape. Their faces haunted him, their voices echoing in his head. They were all counting on him, all waiting for him to stop Gaskins. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing them, that Gaskins was always one step ahead. Weeks passed, and Ethan was nearing his breaking point. The investigation had stalled, and Gaskins had gone quiet, leaving Ethan in a state of restless paranoia. But then, a break came, a small, seemingly insignificant piece of evidence that led Ethan to believe Gaskins hadn't been working alone. Digging through old case files, Ethan discovered a name that had been mentioned multiple times in Gaskins' past: a man named Roy Henderson, a former associate of Gaskins who had disappeared from the radar years ago. It was possible that Henderson had been helping Gaskins, either by providing shelter or resources. Ethan pursued this lead with a renewed sense of purpose. He tracked down old acquaintances of Henderson, piecing together a trail that led him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was there, in the dim light of the warehouse, that Ethan found the evidence he had been searching for: documents, photographs, and detailed maps of the areas where Gaskins had committed his crimes. Henderson had been helping Gaskins all along. With this new information, Ethan devised a plan. He knew that Gaskins would return to the warehouse, and he intended to be there waiting for him. It was risky, but Ethan was beyond caution at this point. He set up surveillance, coordinating with a small team of officers to trap Gaskins when he arrived. But things didn't go as planned. Gaskins was smarter than they had anticipated. He arrived at the warehouse, but not alone. Henderson was with him, and the two men quickly realized they had walked into a trap. Chaos erupted. Gunshots echoed through the warehouse as Gaskins and Henderson tried to escape. Ethan chased them through the darkened corridors, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He was so close to finally ending this nightmare. But in the confusion, Gaskins managed to slip away, leaving Henderson behind to face the consequences. Ethan caught up with Henderson, tackling him to the ground. The man was terrified, begging for mercy, but Ethan was beyond reason. He demanded to know where Gaskins had gone, but Henderson refused to speak. It wasn't until the officers arrived and took Henderson into custody that Ethan realized just how far he had fallen. His hands were trembling, his mind racing. He had come so close to catching Gaskins, only to watch him slip through his fingers once again. As Ethan sat in his car, staring out into the night, the weight of everything he had lost finally hit him. Caroline was gone, not physically, but emotionally. His colleagues no longer trusted him. And Gaskins was still out there, free to continue his reign of terror. The guilt was overwhelming. Ethan had failed failed to protect Caroline, failed to catch Gaskins, failed to save the victims. He had become obsessed, blinded by his need for revenge, and now it had cost him everything. For the first time, Ethan questioned whether he could continue. The darkness that had consumed him for so long was closing in, suffocating him. He didn't know how much more he could take. But then, a new letter arrived. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, staring down at the letter in his hands. His fingers traced the jagged lines of Gaskin's handwriting. It was simple, direct, and unnervingly calm, just like the men who wrote it. "It's time, detective. The end is near, and this is your last chance. You've failed everyone so far, are you going to fail her too? Come find me, if you're men enough. But hurry, the clock is ticking." She doesn't have long. A photograph slipped out from between the folds of the letter, a woman tied to a chair, blindfolded, bruised. Ethan's heart stopped when he realized he recognized her. It was Laura Davis, a journalist who had covered the case for years, someone who had become too curious about Gaskin's past. Now, she was his next victim, the pawn in his final game. The message was clear: find her, or she dies. Ethan's mind raced. Every second that passed brought her closer to death. Gaskins had led him on a twisted path before, always staying one step ahead, but this was different. This time, it was personal. And this time, there would be no mistakes. Ethan stormed into the precinct, ignoring the concerned glances of his colleagues. He didn't have time to explain, he just needed to move. The letter was a map, each line of it holding cryptic clues that pointed to Gaskin's location. But the meaning behind the clues was buried under layers of deception, and Ethan had to pick them apart before time ran out. He worked tirelessly, deciphering Gaskin's twisted riddles. Each clue led to a place from their past, a crime scene, a hideout, a memory that Gaskins had used as a weapon. As Ethan followed the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that Gaskins was watching him, guiding his steps like a puppet master pulling strings. And then the call started. Gaskins taunting him, reminding him of every failure, every victim he couldn't save. "You've always been too slow, Ethan. Too emotional. That's why you'll never catch me. You'll let her die just like all the others." Ethan gripped the phone until his knuckles turned white. He could hear the ticking of a clock in the background, counting down to Laura's final moments. He had to find her, he couldn't fail again. The first location was an old motel where Gaskins had once hid out after one of his earliest killings. It was abandoned now, its walls covered in graffiti and its rooms long since emptied. Ethan scoured the place, searching for any sign of Laura or Gaskins, but there was nothing. Just another dead end. Frustration gnawed at him. Every minute wasted was another step closer to Laura's death. He could feel the weight of failure pressing down on him, the guilt of all the lives he hadn't been able to save. He moved to the next location, a gas station off the highway where Gaskins had been spotted years ago. But again, there was nothing. Just silence and emptiness. Gaskins was playing with him, leading him down a path of false hope, laughing from the shadows as Ethan chased his tail. Ethan's desperation grew. He couldn't afford to be wrong again. The pressure mounted, his thoughts becoming more erratic, more frantic. He hadn't slept in days, and it was beginning to show. Hours later, Ethan arrived at a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city, another location from Gaskin's past. This time, there were signs of life. Ethan's heart pounded as he kicked down the door, his gun drawn. Inside, he found a small room, the walls covered in newspaper clippings about the murders, the faces of the victims staring back at him like ghosts. In the center of the room was a chair, and tied to it was a woman, Laura. She was unconscious but alive. Ethan rushed to her side, untying her and checking for any signs of injury. Relief flooded him, but it was short-lived. Before he could react, the door slammed shut behind him. Ethan spun around, his instincts kicking in. Gaskins stood in the doorway, a smirk playing on his lips. "You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you?" Ethan lunged at him, but Gaskins was faster. He ducked out of the way, disappearing into the shadows of the warehouse. Ethan fired a shot, but it missed, the sound echoing through the empty space. Gaskin's voice floated back to him, taunting, mocking. "You're always so predictable, Ethan. Always so emotional." Ethan followed Gaskins deeper into the warehouse, his gun at the ready. The tension was thick, the air heavy with the stench of rust and decay. Every corner, every shadow felt like a trap. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his pulse racing. He knew this was it, this was the final confrontation. In the center of the warehouse, Gaskin stood waiting, a knife in his hand. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of the hunt, his smile cold and calculating. "You've been chasing me for so long, Ethan," Gaskin said, his voice low and menacing. "But you never really understood, did you? You thought this was about power, control. But it's not. It's about you. You needed me. You needed this chase. Without me, who are you?" Ethan raised his gun, aiming it at Gaskin's chest. His hands shook, not from fear, but from exhaustion, from the weight of everything that had led him to this moment. "Shut up," Ethan growled. "This ends now." Gaskins laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Does it? Or are you just going to let me go again? Let me slip through your fingers, like always." The two men circled each other, their movements slow and deliberate. It was a battle of wills, a test of who would break first. Gaskin's words cut deep, but Ethan pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. In a flash, Gaskins lunged at him, the knife slashing through the air. Ethan dodged, barely avoiding the blade. The two men grappled, the fight messy and brutal. Ethan landed a punch, knocking Gaskins back, but the killer recovered quickly, his movements sharp and precise. They fought for what felt like hours, each man giving and taking blows. Blood dripped from Ethan's lip, his body aching from the exertion. But he couldn't stop, not now, not when he was so close. Finally, with one last burst of strength, Ethan tackled Gaskins to the ground, pinning him down. His gun was lost in the struggle, but it didn't matter. This wasn't about the weapon, it was about ending this once and for all. As Ethan held Gaskins down, panting, bloodied, Gaskins began to laugh. It was a deep, unsettling sound, full of triumph. "You still don't get it, do you?" Gaskins wheezed, his voice hoarse from the struggle. "This was never about them. It was about you. You and me. We're the same, Ethan." Ethan froze, his hands tightening around Gaskin's throat. "I'm nothing like you," Ethan growled. Gaskin smiled, his eyes gleaming with a twisted kind of satisfaction. "Aren't you? You've been chasing me for so long, but you never stopped to ask yourself why. You needed me, Ethan. You needed this. Without me, who are you?" For a moment, Ethan hesitated. Gaskin's words gnawed at him, planting seeds of doubt in his mind. But then he shook his head, pushing the thoughts away. Gaskins was trying to manipulate him, to get inside his head. But Ethan wouldn't let him. With one final, decisive move, Ethan knocked Gaskins out, ending the fight. The room was silent, save for the sound of Ethan's heavy breathing. He stood over Gaskin's unconscious body, his mind racing. It was over, finally, after all this time, it was over. But as Ethan looked down at Gaskins, he didn't feel the sense of victory he had expected. Instead, there was only emptiness. Ethan turned to Laura, who was still unconscious but alive. He knelt beside her, gently lifting her into his arms. She would be safe now, but Ethan knew that he wouldn't be. The scars of this case ran too deep, and he wasn't sure if he would ever truly recover. Weeks later, Ethan sat in his empty apartment, staring out the window. The city stretched out before him, quiet and still. Gaskins was gone, locked away for good, but the memory of him lingered. Ethan had won, but at what cost? His career was in shambles, his relationships fractured. He had pushed everyone away in his pursuit of Gaskins, and now that it was over, he was left with nothing. The price of obsession had been too high. But as he sat there, alone with his thoughts, Ethan felt a flicker of something, hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to move on. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he was still here, still fighting. And that was enough.